Justice Malala's recently released book, The Plot to Save South Africa, tells a story of a 22-year-old rookie journalist at the crime scene in 1993, where Chris Hani is shot and killed outside his home by white supremacist Janusz Waluz in an attempt to stop talks to transform South Africa into a multiracial democracy. Now, that journalist is none other than Justice Malala, who recounts the gripping story that nearly derailed efforts to end apartheid. And Justice is visiting us in studio this morning. Such a pleasure. It is so good to have you here this morning.
It's so lovely to be here. Thank you. I feel like I've come home.
Exactly. I mean, and this is kind of the very much so. It forms quite an important part in the beginning of the story. And when I say this place, I'm talking about the SABC and how things really, really changed. But I'm jumping the gun. I'm just getting so excited to get into this conversation with you. What a book. What a story. I confess I haven't finished it yet because I got it on Friday and I haven't put it down.
Sure.
It really is one of those, it's a page turner. You know the end, but it's the details that we weren't really aware of, and this is where you go into detail.
Absolutely. I wanted to, it's also the story that, I also know the end of the story, and I was there, but you know, when you're a young journalist and you're just starting out, I kept on thinking, is this what it's about? Is this really what happened? Yeah. And 30 years later, well, I started writing the book about 5.5, 6 years ago. I wanted to go back and recreate that time because it was such a pivotal time, a crossroads for me, for the country. All of us were on a knife edge. What would happen the next day and the next day and the next day? Because after the murder of Chris Hani, as Nelson Mandela said, as F.W. de Klerk said, both of them in their books, the country was on the brink of civil war. And so I wanted to go back and remember that time and remember the leadership of Nelson Mandela in particular.
So I want to get a little bit personal first, and then I want to talk about the bigger picture and perhaps throw in what's happening now. But you're this young journalist, you're a rookie journalist, it's Easter weekend, you're working in this newsroom, and we all know what it's like working in a newsroom. You know, it's anything but glamorous.
Yes.
And from one day to the next, you never know what's going to happen. But all in all, you're kind of just going through the motions. Yeah. And then you get the phone call to say, this is what's happening, get down there now.
Absolutely.
So you go down there. What did you see? What is that first thing that you saw when you arrived?
I just remember people in front of the Hani family home just crying. There were people were walking around stunned. I interviewed Mondli Gungubele, who later became the mayor of Ekurhuleni and so forth. But at the time, he was a young Gauteng East Rand leader of the ANC. And I remember just seeing him and just sort of everyone couldn't believe that something so shocking, something so absolutely unexpected had happened. And so, you know, as you say, going through the motions, I had my notebook, there were 3 of us, and we went around interviewing people, neighbors, and so forth. But part of the writing of the story was to go back to that memory and say, how was one processing such a momentous event? And this was literally my first day as a reporter.
The first time you're going out onto a story. If Justice today had to go to that same story, what would you have done differently? I mean, it's almost like a loaded question because you know the kind of outcome of it. But arriving in a place like that, and I know that there were so many things and so many clues that were around there at the time, and you do go into that in the book as well. But would you have done something differently as a journalist going into a story like that?
I think one of the things, one of the reasons why I went back for myself was that as a young journalist, you arrive and you speak to people and you speak to everyone. You don't step back and say, what's the bigger picture? What should I be looking at? Yeah. Sort of above the melee, if you will. And so in a way, I did what was expected, who, what, where, when, why, all that. But I think the story was so big and its dimensions so huge, and it became bigger in the week that I look at and the 9 days after the murder itself, that I feel I should have, and I feel we haven't done enough of looking at the ramifications. We knew that the people who killed Chris Hani wanted to derail the democracy talks and so forth. But on the day, it was people are grieving, people are in deep pain, and that's what I was recording. And in a way, that's important, and that's what we journalists do. But I think the bigger story it sort of escaped me, and that's part of why the going back, if you will.
Indeed, and remembering and going through the steps and actually seeing the repercussions of all of this, because the repercussions were massive. They could have been catastrophic, but the repercussions were massive. And this is where leadership came into play. And you go a lot into the leadership and the click into a leadership position for particularly Mandela and how he handled this, because the whole idea behind this was not for Mandela to sort of succeed or FW to clack. It was for the army to take over the country.
Absolutely.
Which was averted. But the leadership that you witnessed during those days, talk to us about that.
Well, I wanted to, part of writing the book, I wanted to remember that leadership. I wanted us to celebrate it. I always say to people, you know, the Brits celebrate Winston Churchill. They say, oh, he led us through the war and so forth. And, you know, everywhere you go, just this year alone, there must be more than 45 books written already, but every year there are tens of books written about his leadership. And I think in South Africa, we've been blessed with such amazing leadership. We don't celebrate it enough. Over that week, Nelson Mandela went on television, addressed the nation, gave a speech that didn't work, went back, gave a speech that worked beautifully, the speech that many people remember, where he said, I'm reaching out to every South African, black and white, let's come together. A white man full of hate came to our country and shot Chris Hani, I'm paraphrasing, shot Chris Hani, our beloved son. A white man of African origin saw the car, called the police, and the man was arrested. And that speech showed that these people are trying to set black against white, white against black, and derail our path to freedom. And in fact, took the sting out of their attempt, because it said, look, it's not about the race, it's about what these people are trying to do, and that's undercut us. Yeah. And then, you know, there's the leadership of saying we need to grieve, but we need to grieve in a disciplined manner, and how that was directed. So you know, I wanted to remember that. I wanted to be part of the attempt to say leadership matters in South Africa, all over the world. And in that week, we saw leadership that held this country together and made it pass through a very dangerous moment. Yeah,
and that leadership was good at the time. I mean, it really did, as you say. You know, it was where Mandela was in Kunu at the time. He drove back, and you go into quite detail, because you got notes from Mandela's biographer as well, to try and, you know, wheel the two stories together, and then to try and get to the SABC in this very building to make that address, which, as you say, wasn't a very good one at the time. He was stumbling, he couldn't see, and he realized that, and came back 3 days later and gave that talk.
Absolutely. I mean, it was a historic address so on the 10th, on the day of the assassination itself, when he came to the SABC, you know, you'll remember Nelson Mandela's name could not be mentioned on air until 1990. You would go to jail for quoting Nelson Mandela. So for him to sit and address the nation directly, it was almost like Nelson Mandela in 1993 had become the head of the country, had become the person that the country looked to for peace, for direction, and so forth. So even though that speech wasn't the best he'd ever given, it was still historic in many ways.
Indeed.
And that's the one he made the 3 days later is the one that really elevated him to, this is the person who's in charge, who's got the mood of the nation worked out, and who led the nation through that period of grief.
You know, the There was a list, and I mean, we've spoken a lot about the list that was out there of people that were going to be assassinated, and Mandela was the man on the top of the list.
Absolutely.
Chris Hani just happened to be the one that was murdered. I mean, it was Joe Slovo, it was Mandela number one. I couldn't help, when reading this book, to think, what would we have been if it was Mandela? If he was the man that was assassinated? You know, it shocked this. Chris Hani's assassination shocked us to the core, but we managed to work through it.
Yeah.
What would South Africa have looked like had it not been Chris Hani?
Oh, I mean, I think the evil genius of those killers was that they knew to achieve what they wanted to achieve, they really had to make young black activists, young progressives across the country very, very angry and light that spark, that match, and set the country on fire. So I think Nelson Mandela, if it had been Nelson Mandela, it would have demanded that leadership, other leaders come through. I have to say, we had extraordinary people around. We had Oliver Tambo was still alive. He died just a week after Chris Hani's murder. But people like Ahmed Kathrada, Walter Sisulu, Ray Mhlaba were around. And I think evil would not have triumphed that week because other leaders would have stepped forward and we'd be writing a different book and telling a different story. But I think there was enough leadership. You know, you had the top layer of the older generation. You had the Cyril Ramaphosa's and others in the second layer. It would have been different, but I believe that we had the depth of leadership that could have got us through, even if it had been a Nelson Mandela who'd been assassinated.
Ramaphosa, he was there. He saw this leadership.
Yes.
He was a great businessman. You speak about really sterling leadership that got us through that time. Let's fast forward now. You come from Hammanskraal.
Yes,
okay.
Indeed.
And that is hitting deep right now. I mean, we look at the situation in Hammanskraal. We look at the situation in general.
Yeah.
And we talk to the void of leadership in this country. Ramaphosa was there. He couldn't have asked for better role models and leaders to look up to.
Yeah.
In the book, you actually say, and I've got this little quote that you said, in that moment, leadership stood up and proved itself once again. Cyril Ramaphosa in his presidency is not displaying the leadership he displayed that week. Ramaphosa doesn't seem to have learnt from those around him. We lack the values-based, astute leadership seen in that week. Ramaphosa has failed that memory. And that really shook me because we need leadership as badly now as we do there. What went wrong?
I can't say what went wrong. I do think that when the moment comes, whether it's a Hammanskraal situation or many others that have happened in recent times, leaders need to step up. And I'm afraid with the president, you wait and wait and wait, and he dithers and consults and so forth. There's one committee after another. It's actually, for me, having looked at that week when Cyril Ramaphosa was the person who said, we want an election date out of this, and we want a transitional government. And he said, those are demands, they must be met. Today, to see this lack of clarity, this lack of focus is really huge. And when I talk about values, you know, when 23, 24 people die in Hammanskraal, and it's as if it's okay. It's not okay. It's not okay. And I wanted to write a book with Chris Hani at its center because I think the memory of Chris Hani reminds us of who we used to be and who we should be today. And if we don't, and it's not just Chris Hani, it's so many, many thousands who died in the fight against apartheid, whether internally in exile, in prisons and so forth. I think it's an indictment of I think the memory of Chris Hani should remind people that we are better than this, we were better than this.
And let's talk about the memory of Chris Hani and also the legacy. And I worry, and I know many South Africans feel the same way. And it would be amiss to not go to this position of how you know, the question that I need to ask you is, have we failed Chris Hani? Yes, there were people put in jail. I will never forget seeing Dimpo Hani speaking out on the release of Janusz Waluz and talking about how her husband has been failed. How could this be allowed? The reality is that every single year we hear the SACP say the same thing over and over again. We need to look into this. We need to see what the problem is. But you know as well as I know that if they really had the will, they can do it. I mean, some of the biggest names within the leading circles of the ANC, whether we talk about Bladen Zamande, Gwede Mantashe, Ibrahim Patel, all of them, they're all there, Jeremy Cronin, all of them, and yet we still really don't actually know. They talk about an inquest and opening it up again. 30 years later, what are we waiting for?
Exactly, and I think this is a troubling question. That what do you do with power? If you have power, you use it. It's been 30 years since Chris Hani was murdered. Many people might stand up there and criticize Mrs. Hani for being very angry at the release of Janusz Waluz. But I'm not going to sit here and say this is how you grieve. This is someone who has no answers to what happened to her husband. But to the point you make, how is it when you're in power, you stand outside of your power and say, we want an inquest, when within the government you lead, the government in which the SACP is a partner, the ANC is a leader, that you can't make this work, that here's evidence that's still outstanding, go and make the motions and the processes happen so that there's an open investigation and inquest, and we put all the conspiracies to bed about what happened to Chris Hani.
Yeah.
And it don't just help South Africans, it will help the ANC too. Because in the ANC, even today, people are still pointing fingers at each other. This one did this. Where was this one? Why didn't the intelligence services know? Why did the bodyguards get released without the security leaders knowing, and so forth and so forth? This is killing the ANC itself.
Yeah.
So the ANC itself and the SACP should have reopened this investigation a long time ago.
Very quickly, we're running out of time. I've got 2 minutes left with you. The conspiracy theories that you've heard, obviously you did a lot of work in this book and you must have looked into them.
I looked at them, and there are many conspiracy theories. I think at a personal level, I think there was the first layer of investigation that got Janusz Waluz and Clive W. Lewis convicted. I think they're definitely in there. Beyond that, we have many questions, and the key thing is this: reopen the case, let the conspiracies be investigated, so that people like me don't sit there and write books in which we say, that's conspiracy number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we'll have the truth. We'll have the truth for the Hani family, we'll have the truth for the SACP and ANC, and for the country which wants to know what happened to its hero.
Indeed. Have the family seen it? Have they read it?
I've met Lindiwe Hani. I've sent notes to Mrs. Hani. I'm not sure if they've read it yet.
I hope they have. I hope they have. And it would be interesting to hear from them, their perspective on how this all worked. Well, listen, it's a riveting read. It really is. You are a masterful storyteller.
Thank you.
That much I can tell you. You take us to the day and the 9 days that follow thereafter, and you hang on to every word in this book. You truly do. I cannot wait to finish it off and just see sort of where we go with it, and it's absolutely amazing. So, bookstores around the country, this is the book, The Plot to Save South Africa. Justice Malala, thank you for visiting us. We really loved having you.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here.
Absolute
Thank you,
pleasure. Absolute pleasure.